Welcome to What Matters Now, the Times of Israel's weekly podcast, drilling into issues affecting Israel and the Jewish world. I'm your host, Deputy Editor Amanda Borschel-Dan, here with our senior analyst, Haviv Rettig Gur. Hi, Haviv. Thanks for joining me, as always.
It's good to be here.
It's always a pleasure to have you. And Haviv, sometimes you work out your aggressions on Twitter.
Me?
Confirm or deny?
Always calm. A little bit, sometimes, yes.
Okay. And this week, which is Sukkot, you got a bit riled up over a post from Jewish Voice for Peace, in which they used Palestinian iconography on a sukkah that had on it phrases in English and, strangely, in Yiddish. And in your post, there were others who reminded us about the massive Passover Seder plate prop that was also used this year with the Hebrew written backwards. And I don't know if you know this, but there's a really funny bit from the extremely talented and lethal comedian Yochai Sponder. Do you know him? He's an Israeli guy.
No, but now I'm going to look him up.
Definitely look him up and look up a bit about how whenever he hears somebody start a sentence as a Jew, it basically turns him into an anti-Semite. So I thought of that when I saw your post on Twitter. And is this kind of what happened to you when you saw this very cynical use of a sukkah?
I don't mind cynical. And I like the occasional tendency of anti-Zionist Jews wrapped up in the anti-Israel campaign, not in the anti-war campaign. You know, you're anti-war. I respect that tremendously, you know, in certain ways. I'm anti-war. Sometimes I think you have to fight, blah, blah, blah. But the point is that I don't even mind absolutely, you know, angry, rabid, anti-Zionist Jews who I consider deeply ignorant, but, you know, about very specific things. And we've talked about this in the past, and I have YouTube videos on it if anybody's interested. But I don't mind them turning to Judaism because they need to validate themselves to the rest of the Jewish community, which is Zionist in one way or another, or because they just want to convince other Jews that they have an argument, and so they seek a path into the Jewish communal discourse and Jewish holidays and Jewish this and Jewish that. All of that, if your anti-Zionism drives you to become more involved in the Jewish community, we got a Jew back from assimilation and dissolution and disappearing. That's a great thing. That's a positive net gain for anti-Zionism. Anti-Zionism doesn't scare me, and I don't think you can destroy the nation of Israel. And so I'm happy that you're becoming a Jew on this hatred of Israel. That's a good thing. This was more than that. This was a sukkah that wasn't a sukkah. The sukkah in Hebrew is a word whose root is the same root as schach. The plant covering, usually palm fronds in the land of Israel, but elsewhere around the world it could be other plants, that has to cover 50% of the top of the roof. And being covered by natural, unprocessed plants pulled out of the ground, cut down on Sukkot is what a sukkah is. Well, this sukkah didn't have schach. It had nothing on its roof. It had no roof, and it didn't need a roof because it was in the shade of a tree. Okay, now when the Mishnah talks about what a sukkah is, that's a piece of the Talmud. The one big thing is that it cannot be under a tree. It's not the one, there's several, but nevertheless, it's almost definitional that a sukkah, it's literally what the word means, has to have that roof, and it cannot be under a tree, a plant that's planted in the ground. It's the oldest rule of what a sukkah is. And so this was not a sukkah. This was the wall, hanging of a sukkah put up on a college university campus lawn to be a prop of a sukkah. And on it were painted all of these symbols that were an attempt to get away from Zionism, the land of Israel. So the Handala, the Palestinian child iconography was on there, alongside the images of the 7 species, the pomegranate, the fig, the grape, the wheat, which are the most, the among the oldest symbols of the land of Israel in Judaism, among the oldest symbols of Judaism. And there was some English on there, and there was some Yiddish on there about getting away from apartheid. Now, here's the thing. If it had been a politically charged sukkah, I would have said, well, good on them for, beating a path back to Judaism. Even in the name of debating Jews about something really big and important and fundamental, there are anti-Zionist Jews I deeply respect. There's an anti-Zionism that flows out of certain visions of mystical Hasidism. There's an anti-Zionism that flows from the Jewish legal bookshelf and the question of what's called Aliyah B'Choma, if people want to look it up. But there is a debate in Jewish law about returning as sovereigns to the land before the coming of the Messianic age, and whether that's the vision of what Messianic age is or isn't the vision. You can have a deeply serious and spiritual, I should tell you, the majority is Zionist, but there are real, old, deep-rooted, serious intellectual projects that are non-Zionist or even anti-Zionist within Judaism on these questions. And I have no problem with these people. I mean, I debate them, but I don't delegitimize them. I think they're authentic, serious Judaism. And you can even be clumsy and ignorant and try to do that, which a lot of these people are. The Jews in Jewish Voice for Peace are generally much, much, much less knowledgeable or feel a sense of belonging than other Jews generally. I don't even mind if you do it badly, and I don't even mind if you do it with ignorance. This was not a sukkah. This was a prop. And the propification of Judaism, that bothered me. And that bothered me for a very specific reason, because you propify someone's religion to gut it of meaning, to gut it of purpose. And what were they doing? And this was the thing about that Passover Seder, right? When you have a Passover Seder plate, and it isn't that the Hebrew is wrong, and it isn't that you got something a little bit off. The Hebrew is mirror image Hebrew. It is literally reversed. You copy pasted off. You didn't know the direction Hebrew is written in. You're not a Jew.
No, Haviv, you can't say that. I mean, come on. I think you can definitely be a Jew and not...
Can't I? We know that Jewish Voice for Peace at the organizing core has a lot of non-Jews. And when they are challenged on it, they say, well, we're a coalition of Jews and Muslims. What? So you're selling Jewish Voice for Peace. Who runs the place? What actually are you? How could I'm genuinely asking, because I genuinely don't understand. How could you have a Seder plate where the Hebrew words are literally backwards? How could that happen? They're hand done. They're hand drawn. This is a human who did this. Reverse Hebrew. What is that? And so I submit to you that these are people who have never seen these Jewish rituals, have never seen these Jewish symbols or this Jewish language. And not all of them, obviously, but wow, it keeps bubbling up. You described 2 examples that went viral on the internet. There's 100 examples. And they have never seen them because they don't want to be Jewish. They don't know what Jewish is. They've never encountered Jewish. Many of them probably aren't Jewish. The ones who don't know which way Hebrew goes, they're not using Hebrew because they're beating a path back to Judaism. They're using Hebrew because they want to gut it of its meaning. And you know what? They're right. And I'll tell you why they're right. Because Sukkot is not just a holiday about sitting out under the stars. It has to be under the open sky, the Sukkah. That's its basic function and definition. But that's not the only meaning of Sukkot as the symbol of the fragility of existence. It's about the fragility of existence in the desert in the midst of a sacred homecoming to a land. It is also, the Torah itself calls it Chag HaAsif, the pilgrimage of the harvest. It is the harvest time in the land of Israel. That's the agricultural calendar it's linked to. And it's one of 3 great Chagim, pilgrimages. Chag is a cognate in Arabic to Hajj. It's a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. And so you can't detach Sukkot. In ancient times, the most fundamental purpose of Sukkot was Jerusalem, was coming to Jerusalem with the harvest. And so you can't detach Sukkot from the land of Israel. And they want to and they need to. So they take a sukkah, put up the wrong harvest on it, give it over to the Palestinian story, and put Yiddish instead of Hebrew, as if Hebrew is Zionism. Hebrew is the Bible, okay? Hebrew is, if they knew Hebrew, they would know that Sukkot is also a pilgrimage holiday to Jerusalem. Anyway, sorry. Apologize to you, Amanda, and to everyone else, but it's the gutting and the eviscerating of Judaism for the purpose of handing its most fundamental story over to someone else who wants to destroy this connection between Jews and the land that is fundamental to Sukkot. This isn't misunderstanding. This isn't a clumsy attempt to come back, that they're too ignorant to really do it well. That's none of that stuff that I would respect. This is the intentional destruction, immolation of Judaism for the purpose of removing the story that is fundamental to Judaism that connects it to the land. And that's already bigotry and really something very awful that we should point out and call it for what it is.
I agree with almost every single thing you said. I just do want to voice an objection. And this is coming from a woman who is married to a person who has a doctorate in Hebrew. But I would like to say that you can be a full-on Jew without knowing Hebrew. It's not what makes you a Jew. But the use of the Hebrew and the misuse of the Hebrew is, of course, what is upsetting here. And, of course, the 7 species. You've been to my house before, and we have almost all of them in our garden. They grow so easily where we live.
Amanda, you know a Jew or a non-Jew related to a Jew or anyone in the most outlying circles of Jewish communal life who wouldn't get the direction of the Hebrew language right if they were doing it by hand?
100%. Because,
Okay.
I grew up, as you know, without any kind of sense of Judaism, and my distant relatives who have a connection, perhaps they would have been able to point it out. My grandparents, there's no way they would have known the direction of Hebrew. They had utterly secularized to the point that they knew no Hebrew.
Okay. But would they have then drawn posters for the public?
So that is, of course, the problematic nature of this sukkah, which you remember, Haviv, we were in a Talmud class a couple of years ago in which we learned about Sukkot. That's the Masechet, the book that we were studying. And what's so fascinating is that, yes, the identity of a sukkah has to be, as you said, it has to have the schach, but the actual sides of it, which these Jews put so much emphasis on, the sides of the sukkah can be so flexible to the point that, of course, one of the sides can be an elephant, if I'm not mistaken. You remember this class?
Yeah, I mean, but that's obvious that the Talmud says, the walls are not the critical part. The critical part is the roof. And how do you say that? You say, and by the way, they only need 2.5 sides. In other words, it doesn't even need to be 3 sides. Sukkah is extremely easy to build in terms of walls and very, very specific requirements on the top because you have to see the stars through the schach. You have to have enough shade above. There's also a little bit of a fear factor because in the land of Israel, it's the time of the first rains. The Yoreh, which is the famous sort of the special, Hebrew has special words for the first rain and the second rain and the third. In other words, the rains that come when you have 6 rains in a year, some years, the rains become very special. And so you're also risking that rain. And that's part of the point. A sukkah only makes sense as a ritual object in the land of Israel, really fully makes sense. But yeah, so the walls are the Talmud takes great pains to say, don't worry so much about the walls. It's all about the roof.
Let's get to a short break. And we're back. We are recording on Wednesday morning, just ahead of the final Sukkot holiday, which is here in Israel, Shmini Atzeret, joined with Simchat Torah. Of course, that is also the Hebrew calendar date for Hamas's massacre of 1,200 and hostage taking of another 251. Synagogues across the world are marking this yahrzeit, this anniversary of the death of 1,200 people, even as the holiday itself is meant to include pure joy. at the finishing of the Torah and the restarting of the Torah. There was a blip of optimism recently among all Jews, I would say, or most Jews, after the announcement of the elimination of Hamas head Yahya Sinwar last week. And for many, it felt like, or perhaps, I don't know, even still feels like a window of opportunity. One of those Jews is the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, who is here in Israel currently, and yesterday had a meeting with President Isaac Herzog. So let's hear what he had to say.
I believe very much that the death of Sinwar does create an important opportunity to bring the hostages home, to bring the war to an end, and to ensure Israel's security. And that's exactly what our conversations today focused on with our Israeli colleagues, including arrangements for the period following the end of the conflict. It's a conversation that I'll pursue in the region with other partners. But as the President said, this is, and we have to make sure that this is, a moment of opportunity to move forward.
Haviv, the death of Sinwar occurred in Rafah, which the U.S. was basically, I would say, blistering about its objections of a ground operation there from about March until May, when our prime minister actually decided to pull the trigger and enter Rafah. And had Israel not entered Rafah, it's quite likely that Sinwar would still be alive. So this is extremely frustrating to Israelis, to put it in simple terms. And the relationship with the U.S. and Israel has been in the headlines for most of the war, and how the U.S. has been kind of deciding in many ways the pacing of the war, at least. So talk to us a little bit about this.
I think that's exactly right. And it's a Simchat Torah, which literally means the joy of Torah, that is in the middle of war, and war that appears to, it's dying down in Gaza. It continues in Lebanon. My brother-in-law is in Lebanon right now. It is potentially going to expand. We got reports last night that the Israelis had just locked down the response to Iran. And all throughout, and you mentioned, there was a deal, apparently, according to leaks from relevant officials, there was an actual hostage release deal for a third of the hostages, something like that, back in March, that the Israelis felt they could sign on to. And we have this amazing report in the Wall Street Journal, and I think the New York Times picked up on it, and some others, that Sinwar had sent these letters, these email communications to other Hamas leaders, urging them back in March not to agree to any deal. He wanted to sit it out. He wanted Gaza destroyed. He wanted all the damage that could possibly happen in Gaza to then fall on the Israelis. And one of his arguments for not signing a deal, again, they would keep 2/3 of the hostages. It was a very limited deal, and it would give Gaza weeks and weeks of breathing space. But one of his arguments was the Israelis are internally divided. The politics are divided. There are protests against Netanyahu for a deal, which in his view, should raise Hamas's demands, but also the American administration was massively pressuring Israel. And this was, March was, on March 3rd, Vice President Kamala Harris gave this big speech in which she demanded an immediate ceasefire. And she had this infamous March 24, I think she said, it was a famous interview. We covered it 100 times on ABC, where she said, "I've studied the maps of Rafah, and the Israelis can't go into Rafah because there's nowhere for the people of Rafah to go." And of course, that was, put it this way, she had not studied the maps. It was a very silly thing to say, but it was public, and it was pressure, and it was demanding that the Israelis not go in. And it was essentially demanding for domestic American political reasons, I hope, because otherwise it's just sheer incompetence, that Israel allow Hamas to just survive out the war in Rafah forever and ever. And Sinwar wrote in these emails that this American pressure was a reason not to agree to the deal. And he's, of course, the absolute tyrant of Hamas in Gaza. No one can, in other words, it doesn't even matter if someone in Doha, one of the Hamas leadership in Doha, Mahmoud Azhar or Sinwar, or Hania or anyone else disagreed, he wouldn't give the order to release those hostages. So we know that American pressure was seen by Hamas. And by the way, Amanda, you and I and Laser and Manny and David and every single person in the Times of Israel who looks at these issues on a regular basis was saying this in March. Okay, this was so blitheringly obvious. I mean, obviously American pressure. Hamas speaks Hebrew, Hamas speaks English. They're watching, they know, and if they think the Israelis are squirming, that's not when you lock down a deal and let the Israelis off the hook. You hold out. This is basic negotiating 101. And the Americans insisted, again, hopefully for domestic political reasons, because if it wasn't, it's for worse reasons, insisted that Israel sign an immediate ceasefire, and that actually pushed off, delayed, and Hamas openly discussed it within themselves, within the organization, an actual deal. And so now we come to this point where, the Biden administration's leak of Israeli plans, it's not the actual Israeli plans. I don't know if people read closely what the actual leaks were about. It was the American Geospatial Intelligence Agency. I hope I got that right. What an awesome name for an intelligence agency. Assessments of what kinds of weaponry the Israelis could use. The Blue Sparrow is this Israeli missile system. I forget its Hebrew name. And it was just this assessment of in other words, it was kind of American spying on Israel. That's the thing that we learned from it. We didn't learn it. Obviously, America spies on Israel. Again, I hope so. Otherwise, it's a sign of incompetence. But also, it leaked, and it apparently was a mistaken leak. In other words, everyone in the American leadership is now angry and upset. Well, the American administration did this to Ukraine a year ago. It's a way of, if the Israelis are about to do something America doesn't want, leak sensitive intelligence, and then you're pressuring the Israelis not to. It's a kind of, the Americans, I'll tell you why I think this is a real problem for the American people. And I don't want to get into the election, okay? But if they do something terribly mistaken in the relationship with Israel, we're going to talk about it. I apologize that we're doing this less than 2 weeks before Election Day. It's their own fault. They're doing it right now.
Wait till next week when we actually talk about the candidates.
Then people can get angry at us. But right. But if the American administration, okay, if it was thought out, if it was a policy, and the policy was at all costs prevent an Israeli strike on Iran, at all costs. Now, we can have that debate. We can argue, is it good, is it bad? What do we know? But that's a policy. But here's the thing. Constantly holding back Israel, while also constantly defending Israel, while also arming Israel, is just permanent war. The Americans are demanding that we never stop the war. We can't go into Lebanon, they argued, for months and months and months and months. But we should be able to accept 60,000 Israelis who can't go home in the systematic demolition of our towns. That's the non-escalation scenario. The Americans are foolish. How you cannot constantly be addicted to de-escalation, be constantly addicted to not actually striking back, and not understand and not take responsibility for dragging out the terrible war. America has been a force that has dragged out this terrible war. And by the way, the Biden administration has also released, a lot of this sanctions money on Iran, or turned the other cheek, or looked the other way when, a double-digit percentage of Iraqi oil exports to China now are laundered Iranian oil. In the last month, they've started cracking down. In the last even 2 weeks, they've started cracking down on Iranian oil exports, skirting sanctions to China. But it comes because they're afraid of the Israeli strikes. In other words, it comes as a way for the Biden administration to say to the Israelis, "We can do a lot. Don't hit them." Well, if you can do a lot, why haven't you been doing that lot to rein in Iran's budget for all of its proxy wars in the region? There's a sense that I don't know that it's just politics. I'm genuinely afraid that America is phenomenally incompetent. And if you want to rein me in, don't arm me as much. If you arm me massively and then don't let a war ever end because you're so afraid of escalation, well, your enemy is going to organize a strategy that knows you're afraid of escalation and force you to escalate at every turn and just ride that level of escalation to victory. We can't allow our enemies to do that. So we're going to have to constantly burst out of these American demands. And therefore, America is constantly going to look like it can't actually coordinate with us properly. And you add to that the fact that it leaks like a sieve, and you've got a real problem in this administration. We've had a year now of this problem. The American pressure torpedoed and delayed a hostage deal. Let me just caveat that with, I am one of the hawks who don't think Hamas was ever on board with the hostage. In other words, what the Americans lost us is the potential for something that Hamas would then have canceled anyway. But nevertheless, if there was a chance, the Americans are part of the reason it didn't go forward. So I despair of this administration, even as it helps us, even as it's at our side, even as I don't think it's anti-Israel like some of their critics in an election season say. It keeps doing one thing and the other thing all at once and not understanding. It's set against itself in policy terms and prolonging every single part of this war.
Sometimes I think about what's happening here and in the region in terms of a big chessboard, okay? And if you imagine that the U.S. is one side and Iran/China/Russia is on the other side, I think part of the frustration that we are feeling here in Israel and potentially Iran's proxies as well is that we're treated as pawns, but we're actually built to be more like the castle or more like the bishop, to have a lot more power than we're not always being able to enact, right? So if you imagine that the US considers us a pawn, but we have the capabilities of a much better peace, this is very frustrating to both sides. I think what you're saying about, is it just ineptitude in terms of how the U.S. is using us as a piece? Or is it just they don't consider us as a piece to be used properly?
So, I walk through this now. Like I think it's ineptitude. And I think it's ineptitude because in my deeply limited way, I should say, my sort of expertise, such as it is Israeli politics, not the inner workings of the American administration.
And obviously, I'm no chess expert as well, right?
Right. And my 10-year-old beats me at chess routinely. He is, in fairness, good at chess, but still, he beats me routinely. I would say that that's a great analogy. We are a queen in chess terms. We, at all of the last year, have sat on the capability to push back the Iranian proxies on all fronts, cause them immense damage, and reveal the Iranian proxy system for the weak thing that it is. And the Iranians keep doing these attacks that don't cause much damage and then begging for us not to respond. And it's, what we've done to Hezbollah, our sheer grim determination to see Hamas out of Gaza. And Hamas setting a price for that it thought would be so high that we would be ultimately destroyed by it. But it wasn't. They're not capable of setting a price high enough to destroy us, and we are capable of holding the line against Hamas. And if the Americans had actually detached from us and set us free and not helped us and not been our patrons, it's the thing we've talked about a couple of times already. The bombs that killed Nasrallah in Dakhya were Israeli made on an Israeli production line, a new production line that's now working 24/7. To detach us from the need to depend on the Americans. That's not so, the missile defense, we still need the Americans, production lines, etc. But we can fight wars, and they'll be longer, and they'll be more bitter, and they'll be more difficult. And by the way, we'll have to bomb more because we'll be much more vulnerable. But we can fight wars on our own, and we will. And our enemies seek our destruction, and the Americans no longer believe in victory. And the great tragedy is we face enemies so utterly fragile. Right now, over the last 10 days, I think, about October 6th, I think it was, so 2 weeks ago, the Americans imposed new sanctions on Iranian oil to China. There are these oil container ships that carry the oil through Malaysia to China. And they were registered in all kinds of funny ways. And the American Treasury Department has intelligence on these things and knows exactly where they are, and was able to, sanction them, raise massively the cost of Iranian oil in China. And the Iranian oil exports are collapsing. They're growing more expensive. The Chinese don't buy expensive oil for anything. And so they've managed to begin to really hurt the Iranian regime in subtle, delicate ways that the world doesn't see, but the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps utterly depends on to survive financially. They could have done that at any time, and they can do it twice as much. And so the Americans could be pursuing victory alongside us, who are willing to bleed and die for that victory. And they would have no boots on the ground, but they don't have a strategy and a policy, and they don't really want one or understand what it would look like or believe that it's possible. The American administration is these groups of people set against each other, having debates constantly. And the great American, powerful American democracy in this world, on which most of the democratic world still depends to some degree or another, has completely lost its sense of self and ability to function as an actor on the world stage. And so that has been the Israeli experience. I don't know what to do with that, but a year to the war, America's proven to be difficult and incoherent.
Well, Haviv, okay, thanks for all of this. And as I mentioned, we're set to speak again next week, Bezrat Hashem Tvu, and we will continue on with this discussion.
Thanks, Amanda.
Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's What Matters Now. Please check out another installment next week. This podcast was produced by the Podwaves. If you have any questions about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until next week, shalom.